Hello and welcome to Radio Sophia. My name is Shailendra. So at Radio Sophia, we engage with a wide range of phenomena, including ones that have been less researched and less talked about. Today, we are going to discuss about death work and death workers who have been invisibilized in our kind of sanitized social imagery. So circumstantially, when we are forced to acknowledge their existence, we wish kind of that they appear miraculously and do what they need to do, and then they disappear. Phenomenologically speaking, death workers at the micro level, the family and the neighborhood they inhabit at the meso level, and the institutions of caste and the state at the macro level form a complex web of truth. So today, talking about that reality, we have two very special guests, Sohini Chattopadhyay and Sohini Chattopadhyay. Uh, we have a working solution to identify them as Sohini Chattopadhyay, the writer, and Sohini Chattopadhyay, the PhD student. So let me introduce Ms. Sohini is an award-winning journalist and writer. Her work has been translated into German and Bengali and has been commissioned by leading publications such as the New York Times and the Guardian. She is a recipient of the New India Foundation Fellowship to write a book on women athletes. She is also, and I would say, an unconventional film critic who brings sociological and cultural historical lens to her work. She won the National Award 2019 for Best Film Critic. And our second guest, Sohini, is a PhD candidate at Columbia University. She studies death work in colonial India, especially in the context of mass deaths, such as famines and epidemics. She did her master's from JNU, and her broad interest area is in South Asian studies, history of science, and British imperialism. Her dissertation research is funded by the prestigious SSRC and the American Institute. So welcome to both of you again. And the structure of today's session is as follows. We will have the speakers present their work for the first, say, 45 to 50 minutes, 25 minutes each. And then we open the floor for comments and questions. In the meanwhile, you may go ahead typing your questions or comments that you might have in the chat box. So welcome again. Thanks for accepting our invite. I guess we are starting with Ms. Sohini, the writer. Over to you, Ms. Sohini. And I'm pulling up the presentation now. So Kranti, can you give me the rights?
Yes, I have given you. You can share your screen now. Yeah.
So I have pulled up the presentation. Here it goes. When you are on mute.
Thank you, Shailendra. Am I audible now?
Yeah, fine.
Probably a good caveat to add is that it's only been announced that I've won the national award. It hasn't been conferred as yet. So just in case they change their mind, we'd use that term that reporters love to use, which is allegedly won the national award. So this is a photograph that I took of, it says police mob, but it's actually the resting room for mortuary assistants. It's like sort of the place where they change before they do the autopsies. This is at the largest government hospital in Calcutta, which would by extension be the largest government hospital in West Bengal. I'm not a photographer. The photographs are not as good as they should be, but it's a documentation, I think, which is important. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Shailendra, yeah, thank you. So this is the Mortuary. You can read Morgue SSKM Hospital, also known as Institute of Postgraduate Medical Education and Research, IPGMER. And this person who's walking down is actually a mortuary assistant. He's in his work outfit. That apron that you see is his work outfit. And so, I mean, you can see that there's a big sort of hole in the wall, but this, I mean, this is the official front entrance of the morgue of the biggest government hospital in West Bengal. I'll just give you a brief overview of my talk. My work is drawn from my reportage on a curious phenomenon in Calcutta, which is that all the assistants, mortuary assistants working in government hospitals in Calcutta, they all come from members of the same extended family, the Malliks, who hail from a set of villages in Samastipur district of Bihar. And in the course of my reportage, I found that the official government designation, the state government designation for mortuary workers in West Bengal is Dome, which, as some of you may know, is a caste name also. Now, obviously, what this results in is caste group recruitment, and I'll explain this as we go along in the talk today. But it doesn't only mean that domes are recruited, especially in times of crisis such as the current pandemic, and I'll show you what I mean by this. I also found that this practice of recruiting Dalits and Dalit communities for medical work like medical legal work like mortuary assistants is a practice that you see in several parts of India. Mostly they don't use a nomenclature of dome. They tend to use Safai Karmachari. I'll go briefly into the history of dissection and mortuary work in India. And at this point, actually, at that point in my presentation, I'll hand over to my co-presenter, Sohini, because she's the one who's doing work on colonial archives, but she'll focus a lot more on municipal work. My presentation is largely about medical mortuary work. Hers will be much broader in scope. It's also about municipal work of death labor. You know, we'll talk about an interesting group called Murda Farashis and a whole bunch of other kinds of death workers, so to speak. And then we'll end with a little bit of Hindi cinema, just a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So this is an excerpt from my reportage. I was in the second year of my English honors degree at South City College when my father died. His pension stopped, the money in the household dried up, Sanjay said. When a vacancy was advertised in my father's department, I applied. I got the job. It's not what I planned, but it's not bad. So this is the person that you saw in the previous slide walking down from the morgue entrance. His name is Sanjay Malik. He's a mortuary assistant at the government hospital in Kolkata. And his designation is Dome, and we'll come to that later on. His father, Rampreet Malik, his job was to transport dead bodies to and from the morgue in the same hospital, SSKM, also IPGMER. Now, Sanjay had other plans for himself. He wanted to study hospital administration after his bachelor's degree. He was actually studying English honors. The hospital was a familiar environment and he liked it, but he wanted to be a boss. So his father's job was slightly less skilled than him. His father's job was to transport dead bodies to the morgue. He, of course, works as a mortuary assistant. They're both, the designation for both their jobs is Dome. Next slide, please. Another excerpt from my reporting. When Sanjay Malik was 8 years old, his class teacher, Mrs. Mukherjee, summoned his father to school for a meeting. It was the first time Malik Sr. had been called to his children's school. His three elder boys had never made trouble, and Sanjay, the youngest, was no worse than other 8-year-old boys. Mrs. Mukherjee had asked the class to describe what our fathers did, Sanjay recalled. I stood up and said, "My father picks up dead bodies." I've never heard of a child speak of a parent with such pride, Sanjay remembered Mrs. Mukherjee told his father. You take care of this boy, keep an eye on him when he enters that difficult age. Don't let him run wild. So before Sanjay's father, whose name is Rampreet Malik, his grandfather also transported bodies to and from the morgue. So Sanjay Malik remembers at least two generations before him working in the same hospital in Calcutta, and they stay in the same apartment also. They get a not an apartment, a government quarter in the hospital. They stay in the same apartment. And they all three of them, the grandfather, the father, and Sanjay, they all carry the designation Dome. Sanjay's is a storied family in Kolkata. His male relatives work as domes, and I use this as the designation, not as the caste nomenclature. His male relatives work as domes in every one of the 5 government hospitals in Kolkata that have morgues attached to them, including the police morgues for investigations into unnatural deaths. The entire staff of Kolkata's government run morgues come from the Malik clan. In each hospital, Sanjay has a cousin, an uncle, or a nephew. And these jobs, like Sanjay's, were held by their fathers and grandfathers before them. Next slide, please. So the three, broadly, the three sorts of types of work that mortuary assistants, technically called domes in the official nomenclature, three sorts of work they do is autopsy, anatomy, and pathology. So anatomy is, the dissection that they, that is done for medical science students. So the domes help um, the doctors to demonstrate, and they often do some of the dissection work, some of it. And pathology is also, it's a very small part of the work. This is the the rare occasion when a particular disease pathology, say a certain tumor or a certain infection, is seen as very, very special, and the hospital or the department wants to keep a sample of it. So they'll keep a sample of. So that is pathology work. Sanjay works is he's officially recruited for the medico-legal work of autopsy. And this is what he told me. Autopsies require more speed and efficiency, more experience, more character, really. Cadavers that are dissected for anatomy class are usually undamaged bodies preserved in formalin. They smell cleaner. In forensics, there are bodies that have been fished out of lakes 2 days after the person drowned. Decomposition may have set in. Next slide. So if you can just focus a little bit on the photograph, it says the second line, this is an ID card. This is a mortuary assistant's ID card issued by the government. And on the left, if you focus, then you can see that below his name, Sri Sanjay Malik, it says DEG Dome, which means designation Dome. And below that it says Department of Anatomy. So this is, his card is a little old. He told me that when he was recruited, he was recruited for anatomy, but he does, mostly the work that he does is autopsy work, medical legal work. Next slide. Yeah, so this is another more documentation. I said that I would share the dome designation and the fact that it's used um, in government nomenclature. So this is a recruitment circular dated this year. So lots of recruitment is going on because of the current pandemic crisis, and these are all what you call contractual recruitments. But nevertheless, it is official. It's on the letterhead of the government of West Bengal, and uh, if you just try and read, then it says posted as the fifth column. Yeah, just before it tells the salary, you can see that it says posted as dome. And if you see, check the second column where it says name, then you see the name is also dome. Next slide. Another recruitment order, but this I wanted to point this out. This is also from this year. I wanted to point this out because if you notice the third column, which is the name of the candidate, then you see two names which are not dome. There's a guru, which is Nepali family name and not of a Dalit community, and there's a Das. Next slide. Yeah, another government order, though this is a couple of years older than the last two. I've underlined point number 4. I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that it means the designation, the official designation dome does mean caste group recruitment, but it's not that every person who is recruited for this work is dome. But if you see point number 4, it suggests that candidates with working experience as dome um, oblique belonging to dome family will get preference. Again, it's an official order from the government of West Bengal. So that's what I meant to suggest, that the the use of the designation dome means that they do also, it also works as a sort of reverse reservation. Yeah, thank you. Um, for those who can read Bengali, this is the biggest Bengali language paper. It's the paper of record in West Bengal. And this is a series that they're carrying on COVID. Now, this story that they've carried is by the person about whom the protagonist in my reporting on mortuary assistants and domes in Kolkata. So it's Sanjay Malik. And for those people who can read Bengali, just below his name, it says dome. So there have been other stories carried in the same series by doctors, nurses, technicians, and they typically it will say, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I'm not sure how many people can read Bengali, but so for others, for instance, it will say intensivist, or it will say uh, gynecologist, or it will say nurse, but his designation, which is the official designation, it's not that it's incorrect. I just wanted to show that this is widely uh, the designation or the reference that is used for mortuary assistant. Next slide. This is a quote in my story, and it's from the head of the forensic department at the time when I reported the story. He's quite well known in West Bengal, this gentleman, because whenever there is at least in the last, at least for a decade or so, whenever there was a prominent unnatural death, then and there was reporting in the newspapers, he would be quoted because he's the head of the forensic science department. This is what he told me. I've always worked with a Malik in my career. I don't know how it is, but I have. I started some 30 years ago. Before that, I was a medical student. As far as I remember, the professor's assistants were also Maliks. we didn't pay attention to these things really. We focused on medical science, on scientific findings. But I do know that we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without the domes. So this is what Professor Kahali, Dr. B.N. Kahali is saying is more or less what Sanjay Malik was also telling me, that his before him, his father, his grandfather, and all his relatives, their parents, their fathers before them would be doing the same work. And this is what Professor says as well. He says that I've always worked with a Malik, and when I was a medical student, the professor's assistants were Maliks. In fact, he also travels sometimes when there is a prominent death outside Calcutta, and he travels to the districts. Um, he said that those domes that he's worked with are also Malik. So this is very specifically to this curious phenomenon in Kolkata, that all in West Bengal actually, that all the mortuary assistants in government hospitals uh, seem to be from one extended family. So this is obviously how caste networks work. You know, whenever a vacancy opens up, as we saw, the government also encourages it. It says uh, members of the dome family will be preferred. So this is an example of how a caste network works in recruitment. And what Dr. Kahali doesn't say is that uh, domes do the main work of dissection. Most of the bodies that require an autopsy for a medical legal purpose, it most of the work is done by a dome. Yeah. And the doctor, so what Dr. Kahali does is that he would instruct them very occasionally, if it's a very prominent death, something which is in the news, then he may uh, do some of the dissection himself. But usually they instruct them, check this, check that, and the domes actually do the work. Yeah, next slide. This is a quote from Dr. Indrajit Khandekar, who is quite well known as an activist in forensic sciences. He's best known for his work for his PIL, where he asked and he found out that the two-finger test, which is used for, it's been banned by the Supreme Court, but it is used for rape, confirming whether rape has taken place. So Dr. Khandekar found that despite the 2013 change in law after Jyoti Pandey's gang rape in Delhi, it was still in practice. So that's what he's most well known for. But he also does a lot of activism related to the rights of mortuary workers. In Maharashtra, he says that they are called Safai Karmacharis. He works at the NGIMS, which is a very unique rural government hospital. In Maharashtra, we do not have a dome classification. The sweepers or attendants do the job of forensic assistants. They are mostly from the untouchable caste, Mahars and Bhangis. We don't have trained medical technologists. Safai Karmachari is a broad designation used. Next slide. This is photographs from the work of Arun Vijay Madhavan, photojournalist, photographer. He is with the collective called PEP, Photographers for Environment and Peace. He's worked extensively with mortuary workers in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, where also they're called Safai Karmacharis. And this is a quote from one of his photo essays published in Better Photography magazine. Since it is considered a dirty job, hospitals prefer sanitation workers who belong to the Dalit community to do this. A month after joining the work, they are trained to dissect corpses. Next slide. This is an excerpt from the reporting of one of my contemporaries, Rudranil Sengupta, and this particular report, which was published in Mint newspaper. I've got a little snapshot of the piece, so in case anybody wants to read up. It's an excellent report. His reporting is from Delhi and Uttar Pradesh. I'm mentioning geographies just so that you have a sense of the places where we've been able to document. Reporters, researchers have been able to document the practice of hiring Dalit communities for this very specialized medical legal work. So his is from Delhi and UP. This is an excerpt from his report. At 1337, Rakesh has the body laid out on the stone table in the autopsy room, lit by a bright, naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. He takes a crude, rusted knife and makes the first incision, a carefully drawn straight line with a slight leftward deviation to bypass the navel, beginning from just under the Adam's apple and ending just above the penis. The line splits the upper layer of the skin. Now he picks a 6-inch knife, as rusted and rough as the first one, its handle held in place with a twine of blue plastic. He begins to cut through the layer of fat under the skin along the incision and then through the flesh. Next slide, please. Rakesh, a continued excerpt from Rudranil's piece. Rakesh is not a forensic surgeon. He is not a doctor. His official designation is Safai Karmachari. He is the mortuary's cleaner. Today, he will cut open 6 bodies, inspect them inside and out for injuries, remove the organs and weigh them before putting them back into the stomach cavity, stitch the bodies up, wrap them in plastic and a cotton sheet, and hand them back to the family. The doctor actually assigned to do the autopsies will come in half an hour after the commencement of the first body and will get to wear a mask, gloves, and a gown, but he will never once touch a corpse. From my own reporting in Kolkata, I can see that the situation, the scenario here is absolutely similar. Doctors will visit the mortuary for regular medico legal cases barely for 15 to 20 minutes. They issue instructions based on the police reports that have come in with each body, and they will sign the reports. In the case of my reporting on the protagonist of my story is Sanjay Malik. In the case of Sanjay Malik, he's literate. He almost got his graduate degree in English honors. He actually writes the report as well. The doctor corrects it wherever required and signs off on it. I couldn't write this in my report because Malik didn't want this to be on the record, because obviously his job may be on the line. But Rudranil has been able to get this on the record. Next slide. This is 2 screenshots from a video documentary by a human rights activist called Kiriti Roy, and he runs an organization called Masoom. I could have run a little clip from it, but I decided not to because it's quite graphic and it might induce nausea. But the particular screenshots I used is where the doctor is saying that the person, the people who are making the documentary film are asking the doctor who does the autopsies, and the doctor is saying that doctors do it, who else will do it? And then the documentary interviewer is asking, don't the domes help? And he's saying, yes, the domes do help. This documentary, it's available on YouTube. If anybody is interested, I can send the link. It was reported from West Bengal, Odisha, and Jharkhand, where the nomenclature seems to be dome as well, not Safai Karmachari. But once again, a suggestion of geography that here too there is the practice of recruiting Dalit communities for this very specialized work. I also just want to, you know, point out that this is, I'm not at all indicating any sort of doctor bashing. I'm just referring to existing practices and existing power structures. It's important to remember that medico-legal autopsies are medico-legal procedures, and they are typically done only in government hospitals, and government hospital doctors are under, they have a lot of responsibilities, they have a lot of stress. They, in addition to doing, in addition to supervising autopsies, they also have teaching and research responsibilities and sometimes administrative responsibilities. So I'm just saying that this is not doctor bashing, but it's possible to retain a level of criticality and observe, contemporary practices and power structures. Next slide. So a little bit of history now, just to give a sense of when did autopsies, dissection of medical, dissection of bodies for medical science, when did that start in India? If you can focus on the image to the extent that it's possible on a, on a screen. This is a painting of Dr. Madhusudan Gupta, who is said to be, he's credited to be the first subcontinental native, since we didn't have India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan then, the first subcontinental native to perform a dissection in, and he did this in Calcutta, 1836. If you notice the image, it's a portrait, it's a painted image. On his hand is a skull. I wish the image quality was better, but that's what it is. And this is from a paper which I'll tell you the reference to it. This day will ever be marked in the annals of Western medicine in India, when Indians rose superior to the prejudices of their earlier education and thus boldly flung open the gates of modern medical science to their countrymen. The date when this happened is 10th January 1836. I have a correction actually. This is the first dissection of a cadaver in Asia, so not just in the subcontinent, by a non-white person. This painting is by Mrs. Belnos, and it was presented by John Drinkwater Bethune. Those who are familiar with Calcutta and Bengal will know that Bethune is a significant figure. It's a very famous college and school in Calcutta called Bethune School. Though the college and school are named after this English administrator, but it is associated with the energy and enterprise of Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay, better known as Vidyasagar, very, very well-known Bengal Renaissance reformer who advocated widow remarriage, advocated the education of girls. And this Bethune is a very, very important institution in Calcutta, the first woman who is a medical graduate and went on to practice medicine for almost 4 decades in India. Kadambini Ganguly, she was a student of Bethune School and College. Next slide. So this is from the same paper. Apparently, to mark Dr. Gupta's dissection of a cadaver, there was a 50-gun salute from Fort William in Calcutta. The momentous event was duly celebrated in rather militaristic fashion by firing a 50-round salute from the guns of Calcutta Fort William. Next slide. This is a notice, an obituary notice in a Bengali newspaper called Bengali journal called Sambad Bhaskar, when Dr. Gupta passed. Madhusudan Babu was the pioneer of the dissector artisans of India. To the Indian people, especially Hindus, touching the dead body is an abominable question. Better not to say anything of dissection. Yet, on entering medical college, he was the first amongst the Hindus to be engaged in the act of dissection. Next slide. So, this history of dissection and specific deification of Dr. Madhusudan Gupta. There's even a lane in Calcutta named after him called Madhu Gupta Lane. It's in College Square area of this heart of Calcutta, very historic part of Calcutta. So I brought this up only to bring up the history of erasure of Dalit communities who've been working in dissection in the very specific. You saw the previous quote, the obituary notice, and how it praises Dr. Gupta for doing something exceptional by touching the body. So you see the deification of an upper caste person, obviously, and it lends itself to the question that when were Dalits brought into the medical system, the hospital system? So my answer is um, at least from the 1850s, and this is largely thanks to the work of to the research of the other Sohini, who's found documentation from 1843 in Medical College, Kolkata. But and she'll tell you more about it when she takes over just a minute or two later. But I suppose what we can say about the for for certain the dates that we can say for certain that Dalit community started being recruited into the medical system is 1898. This is an important date because it's the year the Criminal Procedure Code was implemented. 1862 was the Indian Penal Code, but that is like a listing of what is a crime, all the things that are criminal activities. But the Criminal Procedure Code lays down what is to be done, what is the investigative procedure. So at least from 1898, we can assume that Dalit communities were recruited in large numbers. In case of West Bengal, it may be that, or in case of Bengal presidency, because there was no West Bengal then, that there may be evidence of this from several decades before the Criminal Procedure Code from the 1850s. Do we know the first Dalit who dissected a dead body? Unlike Dr. Madhusudan Gupta, who had a 50-gun salute, had obituary notices, had a painting painted and presented by Bethune, John Drinkwater Bethune. We don't know the first Dalit who did this, or the first Dome who did this. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Yeah. What we do have is a story from the Mahabharata, which Sanjay Malik told me, which is the story of Sudarshan Bhakt. So he says that when the Kurukshetra war ended after 18 days, a gong indicating that the war is over did not ring out. So because it did not ring out, the citizenry at large felt that the war was not over because that gong had not rung out. So Krishna told Draupadi that this has happened because we have not called the Dome Raja, Sudarshan Bhakt, for a meal, and you must call him and you must look after him and feed him with great respect. And so that was done. Sage Sudarshan was invited, was Draupadi cooked for him, and she fed him. And after he was satisfied, the gong rang out. And so he says that this even though the medical history of India may not mention rooms, but there is mention of them in the Mahabharata. Now, if you look up Sudarshan Bhakt or Sudarshan, Sage Sudarshan online, there are quite a few online stories on the Mahabharata, quite a few online repositories of the Mahabharata. This exact story is not there. So once again, my other presenter, Sohini, will talk much more about erasure. But even here, there may be this erasure. I decided to honor the unheard story by mentioning this to you. Next slide. Yeah, so we hand over to the other Sohini, whose work is much more to do with municipal system.
Okay. Thank you, namesake Sohini. This is going to get interesting. I just keep up with the spirit of what you discussed, but also bring that to the domain of sort of municipal practices. And right now, what I'll do is, we all know that municipal practices of death covers a large terrain of burials, cremation, star of silences, and so on. But I want to particularly here focus on a particular technology of incineration, mostly because it's very similar to dissection, which was allegedly brought into practice in colonial India as a modern practice, a scientific practice, and a secularized practice. We also then have to think about other such practices and think about how they reworked social differences in cities, how they reworked caste, if at all, and what are the enduring legacies of those in the same way as a previous presentation told us about. So just to briefly talk about this cover image, this is one of the earliest crematorium in India. It's in Calcutta. It's the first gas crematorium. The gas supplied was through pipeline, the pipelines which existed for a long time. If you go through Raja Bazaar, you can see those pipeline tanks even now. This crematorium, unused, and it's located currently near Park Street in present-day Kolkata. It was established by the Cremation Society of Bengal in 1899 by British officers, European, all of them, who were convinced by the cremation movement in Europe. So keep in mind that right now we are moving away a bit from the practices of cremation that we see as vogue in India. I'll come to that a little later. And this is because many of these officers actually turns out to be a dwindling number eventually. They wanted to do away with the expenses of burials and the fact that the burials were focused on monumentality, and these practitioners thought that that's not the ethical way to die. The idea was to create also a sense of a chapel, as you can see, and the incinerator was put in between. I have perused the annual report of this society, the Bengal Cremation Society, extensively. It's there in the National Archive of India. And through that, we get to know a few things. I'll just tell you what the report tells us broadly. That it tells us that the Cremation Society of Bengal also inspired members of the Brahmo Samaj to use this machine. The cost of this machine was borne by private receipts and also grants and aid by the government of Bengal, who also donated the land. The incinerator was imported from France. It was fairly expensive in those days. Despite the fanfare, and it was a lot of publication in local newspapers about it, the crematorium was not popular. Europeans continued to bury their dead in the prestigious cemeteries in Lower Circular Road. Again, anyone familiar with Calcutta will know that it's a crucial junction. Lots of traffic. Each year from 1905 onwards, the incinerator managed to cremate about 10 to 12 bodies at the most, maybe 4 in a regular year. It eventually went defunct and lost in competition from municipality-sponsored, more subsidized electric furnaces after independence. None of these reports, however, include any detail about who worked with the machines. we don't have employment receipts, which is very distinct from sort of like, the archival records you get of medical colleges, which do not, as Sohini pointed out, do not acknowledge the fact that the main task of dissection was done by Dalit workers. But at the same time, these hospitals in the colonial time had within their payrolls the designation of domes. So we could get a sense of who were the people working in it from basic things like payroll receipts and so on, and the fact that there were dome quarters in hospitals and medical colleges. For the Cremation Society of Bengal, a public-private partnership, we don't have such receipts. It's almost as if like, the machines were self-serviced. Now, why is this so? Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So this, I think, and this is obviously pretty common knowledge amongst a lot of academicians and social scientists, is that like the peculiar relationship that caste had to colonial modernity. Just give me one second. Yeah. So this takes us to the very strong nexus between the millennial history of caste practices and caste power, which means that, that's something we can like way predate before colonialism. And it also takes us to the modern history of colonialism and capitalism. Now, colonialism, as we know, was justified through the notion of scientific progress more often than not, which is why we get quotes such as we do of Madhusudan Gupta about the gun salute and the idea that colonial modernity is bringing to the natives a culture of scientific temperament. And complicity with caste does not quite fit into this narrative of progress. It does not fit into the narrative of progress for British administrators who were trying to justify scientific progress. It, of course, does not fit into the nature of progress of upper caste Bhadraloks who are also trying to mimic their own variety of progress. So much like we heard about the role of stigmatized work being erased in medical colleges and mosques, the same pattern follows in the cities, each terrain sort of reflecting the other. And this example sort of tells us something very crucial in this, which is that the sanitary commissioner of 1864, he was also the first sanitary commissioner, points out that the role played by domes, again, he uses by this time that it's already a designated professional term. He says that the role played by domes in death work was local custom, that the colonial state had to respect. He asserted that he strongly abhorred this system. This basically also tells us about a fundamental thing of disavowal by Strachey, who knows that caste labor Dalit labor is integral to practices of modern science. But at the same time, modernity cannot be acknowledged as such if so-called pre-colonial, pre-capitalist form of labor is sneaking into the picture. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the fact that it's this Dalit labor that is also getting remorphed into modern capitalist labor systems. And there is a unique sort of condition of labor that is occurring in India, which carries within itself the inherent problematics of both the millennial history of caste practices and the modern history of colonialism. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So what I ended up doing for a brief while, which is why I ended up interfacing with Sohini's work as well, is that to actually understand how these incinerators and incinerators work, and to understand its science of it, taking into my practice the full cognizance of the social difference that it articulates, I started going to crematoriums and burial grounds in Bombay and Calcutta and conduct oral history interviews. And in the process, I got to know sort of much to clarify my own ignorance about how the machines work and how do they reflect and also reform and rework the social differences around it. So for example, D. Sahu, the special in charge of Shiriti cremation ground in Kolkata, when I told him about why I'm here, because he asked me about what brings me to a cremation ground, even though I'm a historian, and he specifically asked me that, like, you're not a journalist. So there was that question, and I told him my problem. I said, like, I don't get any information about the work that is done. So I just thought that maybe, despite the fact that this is an electric machine as opposed to a gas crematorium, can I just sit and observe? And he clarified very clearly that, to quote, obviously the books don't tell you anything about us. Be our witness. You can compare our present with the past and then write the history. So I'm very grateful to Mr. D. Sahu for sort of, outlining my methodology of research. So let's a little briefly about what I learned. So to sort of supplant the archival gaps. Could we just, yeah. So the small CDT cremation ground, I don't have pictures of it because it was in use at that point of time, and I didn't want to get pictures at that point. The body count adds to about 3,000 to 3,500 bodies a year in this very small cremation ground. It's not one of the most popular ones. And then the Kolkata Municipal Corporation has 7 such public cremation grounds. Bigger cremation grounds in the city can cremate up to 30 to 40 bodies a day. And this, I'm talking, pre-COVID. The workers wait and control the temperature, keep an eye on when to use water to cool the machine down in an emergency. They shake the dust tray when the ashes fall and check if the chimneys are working. And it's a very important thing to do continuously. At the same time, other workers attend the family, preparing the next body for the furnace. At all times, the furnaces are busy. In fact, you can go to the Calcutta Municipal Corporation website to check the queues in these incinerators, and you'll always see a wait list of at least 10 people. It can take up to 55 minutes to more than an hour to cremate a body. The workers at the cremation grounds assess the heat according to the weight and size. So that requires a lot of work and skill of commensuration. On an average, also, it's a very risky business. The temperature ranges from 700 degrees Celsius to 850. And again, none of these information are things that you will get in sort of the archives, or the ones at least I looked at, like the National Archive of India, the West Bengal State Archives, which predominantly have documents written by colonial bureaucrats in the capital of the colony, Calcutta, and then Delhi, or for the West Bengal State Archives in Calcutta, colonial Calcutta. And here's another interesting fact as to why I bring about incinerators, to think about how colonialism had the potential to bring about a different form of history of death. The incinerator is different from the traditional funerals of upper caste Hindus, as we know, which we so commonly see in popular representation, including the recent images of cremation in India that appear on the New York Times. We know, of course, that new technologies bring with it new social relations. So my question then is, in the colonial period, did we see the electric and before that the gas crematorium bring about any radical shift in how it aligned with the social differences of its surroundings, its cities, and its workers? So this is sort of the Times of India report of the first electric crematorium in Bombay. It was established in 1949, at the same time as we get another incinerator in Delhi. Keep in mind, in Delhi, this is a moment of like increasingly settled down, but still moments of partition violence. So we are talking about a moment of mass death. In the case of Bombay, it was also a time when the city and the state itself was thinking about progress in terms of scientific progression quite a bit. So these are the two reasons why these two cities had incinerators. For Calcutta, I'll go back to that history a little later because that has a little different as a history. So these actually these became so popular, the electric crematorium in Bombay and Delhi, despite the fact that in Delhi it came to disuse pretty soon, is because again it showed a sign of modernity and progress, which was coupled by a new scientific ethos of India's independence. It was again covered by the New York Times, the Times, and so on. A lot of journalistic biggies, as we know. The picture on the left is how the incinerator was imagined around this time. That's one of the earliest incinerators by Siemens, which, as we know, has a very checkered history in Germany in the 1940s. This is not the same Siemens as the company we know, but its founder was the brother of the founder of the Siemens company as we know today. And they try to keep themselves away from this history, and we don't have archives of this Siemens in particular anymore. So what is this history of the incinerators? So as I said earlier, it's pretty distinct from the the funerals of open air cremation. It was in fact also largely part of, could we go to the next slide? I'm sorry, I just lost my screen for some reason. Yeah. So the inspiration here was the Woking Crematorium, which was in England, where again, similar to the Cremation Society of Bengal, people thought that it's a great way to think about sanitation and also the larger issue of rising real estate cost of burial land. The Woking Crematorium was constantly cited by the Cremation Society of Bengal. In fact, the founder of the Woking Crematorium was an honorary president of the Cremation Society of Bengal in 1905. And in 1949, in 1950, when incinerators were imported in Bombay and Delhi, the municipalities of both these cities also spoke about the Woking Crematorium and said that this was the inspiration. Of course, the first one, if you go to the next slide, is the crematorium in Milan. Please note here how these were trying to radically alter existing norms of death monumentality, but at the same time co-opting and making things look making the transition pretty seamless. This incinerator in Milan, again, note the architecture around it, the edifices of a glorified mausoleum, very typical of Italy, as you know. And unlike the one in Woking, this does not bear a cross. So we keep that in mind. Could we go to the next slide? So this is the incinerator of the Bengal Cremation Society's incinerator, which was brought in from Paris. It took about 6 months to get it to the city and then assemble it. And the Cremation Society annual reports mention the high cost of installation as well, because India did not really have the know-how to put up an incinerator for human death. The Bengal Cremation Society became an inspiration in a lot of other cities as well. Again, the Bombay, I bring this up time and again, because the Bombay and the Delhi municipalities' establishment of the crematoria, they keep on mentioning the glorification of this gas crematorium in Calcutta, which was for Europeans, as opposed to the fact that the ones in Bombay and Delhi were, obviously, they were for Indians at that point. Could we go to the next slide? And just so you know, you get a good idea of it, this is some of the most cutting edge, recent looking incinerators. You can see them available in various companies. They're mostly made in India now, with the small parts and engines imported from outside. Could we go to the next slide? And this is just broadly a layout of a cremation ground plan currently. It's part of the Clean Ganga project. It's a model crematoria. It should ideally be implemented in the next few years if things go well. And just keep an eye here that this is what the inside of a crematorium from an idealized point of view looks like. Note that it mentions on the right office and office of the caretaker and office, where most workers are supposed to be. They perform here the task of writing the cremation certificate, take the money, and so on. This is also, incidentally, if you visit a cremation ground, this is where many workers come to rest, because more often than not, this has the fans, unlike the heated areas otherwise. In some places, like bigger cremation grounds, they have ACs as well. But at the same time, you will also see workers all over because of how busy these are. Now, let us go back to history then. From all these, like all the slides that I just showed about these machines, very sanitized look. It almost looks very radically different from, the open air cremation that we see, and again, which became so common in our pictures and our photographic idea of coronavirus's death count. And let me just quickly add a side to that, and that's partly because the pictures were taken from Delhi, which doesn't have too many incinerators. They practice 95% of their cremation are open funerals, as opposed to Calcutta, where incinerators are the major forms of death disposal for people who practice cremation. So just that aside. But anyway, these sanitized pictures give us a sense of the fact that they were sites of some sort of radical transformation. They were sites where people, Dalit laborers, were brought in as scientific assistants. But again, if you look at municipal payrolls and so on, that's not the case. It's again, even here, very similar to what Sohini had pointed out for the medical colleges and mosques. You'll again see pay receipts which use the word dome again as a professional category. It's not something that we get a sense of in terms of caste category, but we get a sense of how the caste category became a professional category. And in these municipal reports, we also get to see certain quibblings. Like if you can go to the next slide. This, for example, there was a protest against incinerators in 1932 in Calcutta. This was for a particular incinerator that was established in the waste disposal ground of Calcutta, Dhapa as we know it. Again, those of you who are familiar with Dhapa and with Kolkata generally will know that at one point of time, and even now, it's on the fringes of the city. It's sort of considered a site of like garbage and defilement. And this is exactly the place where the incinerator was established in 1920s for Indians and not for Europeans. And it was particularly for those who were unclaimed, so unclaimed bodies, and dissected body parts. So we have a connection between municipality and medical colleges right here. This still exists. This is the same place that the incinerator still works for unclaimed bodies, just so you know. So in 1932, there were protests by several people in the municipality. Some of these people included stalwarts and big names, most of them, of course, with absolute upper caste surnames like the Mukherjees and the Chattopadhyays. So Shama Prasad Mukherjee was one of them who actually protested against the rituals that were occurring in the space of this incinerator on Dhapa. This is, again, like I said, this is where the bodies of the poor were cremated. And so the incineration of bodies through these machines, particularly in this area, in the sort of the waste disposal dump, it is also, again, where animals like stray dogs were cremated. This also buried. All these tasks were performed by possibly, and I mean, one can pretty much sure guess the lineages of it. They are performed by Dalit and Bahujan labor, because but at the same time, in 1932, what these politicians in the municipality pointed out was that, let me just quote, that the work of performing the last rites so long lay with the domes, in the sense that it is clarifying that for unclaimed bodies, domes were the ones who were also doing the work which was supposedly in the domain of the priestly caste, the Brahmins. The quote goes on. This is in the it's an excerpt from a municipal report, but it is not from the municipality. The municipality did not just brought in this quote, and that's how I found it. It says, people whose touch rightly or wrongly is considered as defilement and against the principle of Hindu Shastras prevailing from time immemorial. This work has been taken up and every body receives the services of a Brahmin. So there was a charity, a local charity that came up that actually started to reclaim unclaimed bodies whom they identified as Hindus and then give them upper caste rituals. And all this was because of the protest against incinerators and the fact that incinerators defiled caste practices. Just carefully look at this statement. It says people who touch rightly or wrongly. You know, there's a lot of hedging with words around this time. Keep in mind that this is the same time when many of these founders of local charities and so on were also strongly engaging with the politics of numbers that were being brought about because of Ambedkarite politics. So this is also a group of upper caste men in Calcutta, very much aware of things that are happening outside the city, and also wording their terminologies very carefully, so as to not also sort of evade, like create trouble in their own politics of number at a time when they are all participating in the municipal election. So we see a lot of careful wording and a lot of hedging and a lot of sanitization, but even then, through then sort of like the broader ideas come through. Could we go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is an article. I took this from an article by a journalist called Vidhi Doshi, who wrote about Dhapa. And this is, again, if you see the fumes, it's a site of garbage disposal. It's also the site of incineration. Now we come to the idea that, you know, as opposed to like sort of those sanitized pictures of incinerators that I showed you previously, which makes it look like it has sort of these ways to secularize ideas of rituals. And through rituals, I of course also mean caste, and which is like fundamental to the project of being a Hindu. We see ultimately that these incinerators, the moment they are for like common people, the poor and so on, it gets into areas of the city that are also broadly, its surroundings are demarcated by its segregation. The crematorium for the poor in Calcutta, for example, here in Dhapa, it's look at the picture of it. The site, it's sort of like the site of everything decrepit, and the workers are themselves invisibilized in the larger history of progress of the cities because they are pushed literally to the margin. Even if you like go past this part of Dhapa is covered by sort of the PC Chandra Gardens and so on. So even those who are traveling through the EM bypass road don't exactly get to see this. Crematorias are located in areas also where the real estate value tends to fall. And they are also chosen in areas where real estate value isn't that good. It's the same case in a lot of places, in Delhi and Bombay and so on. The surroundings, therefore, have an air of being in the margins of the city, much like how the labor depicts itself. This is, of course, let me just clarify, distinct from sort of more celebrated ghats like Manikarnika Ghat in Benares, which has a slightly different and more complicated and a longer history. So then we can sort of conclude that new technologies, be it dissection or incineration, open up by the dint of its the nature of its technologies, certain radical potential sure to transform social relations. But actually, it also is intertwining the role of social power of caste by the very dint of the fact that the architects of these cities come from the ones who propagate the system, and the capitalist desire for cheap labor reinscribing the same marginality of caste all over again. In this way, then, the implications of caste in the most modern and secularizing forms of death are simultaneously inscribed through its marginality and also effaced through that very practice. So then when do we really get to know through archives or through city-based practices about death work? It's in moments like this. It's when sort of the social contract between the middle class and the upper caste are broken, because we are seeing a number of death that the working class has possibly seen from a much longer time. Is that sudden? This is the moment when suddenly we come to a sort of awareness about the work of death around us. And if history has its trends to show, this interest will soon go away once the pandemic, the crisis is over. So I'll just give you around 3 instances of the spike in interest in death work and how they went away with moments of mass crisis. Could we go to the next slide? Yeah. So again, in the state archives, we only see visibility of death work in the event of mass death. Example 1, in 1860s, as cholera ravaged Bengal, the Calcutta municipality expected the mortuary workers to work overtime to dispose of the bodies of cholera victims without any compensation. These were mostly bodies that were found in the river, very similar to what we have also seen now. And death workers who were then designated as murda farashis were supposed to either pick those bodies up from the river or tie a stone onto them and drown them properly. The more common practice was to tie a stone and drown them, because picking up would mean cremating soggy bodies, not something that is economical. So death workers in Calcutta refused to work in 1864 till their salaries were increased. Interestingly, salaries were increased after 4 years. By that time, the problem of cholera death had somewhat reduced, even though the murda farashis were still taking out bodies from the rivers, and we get information of that from the 1920s, 30s, and so on. And it's there in, like, popular depictions of Calcutta, like, in Dominic Lepierre's City of Joy book, where a picture of body floating in the river is made to be central to the life of Calcutta. Could we go to the next slide? Again, in 1898, grave diggers in present-day Latur refused to dig graves, complaining of the increased number of bodies due to the plague. We again see the Plague Commission write about this because this was a moment of mass crisis. Colonial sources do not suggest that the local municipalities provided instructions or equipment for the safety of mortuary workers, but it does suggest that within 3 days, their demand for an increased salary were met. This is possibly because at the time of the plague, the emergency was heightened by the fact that it had become an international issue that could have crumbled, had the potential to crumble the global economy of the British Empire. So this was a moment of interesting bargaining point for extremely stigmatized worker. And this is how they sort of come into something as high profile as the Plague Commission report. Could we go to the next example? This is the final example, and I leave it at that because this is a problem that we see even now. So during the massive Bengal famine in 1943, there was a crisis in death disposal, as many workers also died of starvation and disease. A relief worker in Calcutta commented in 1944 that it was difficult to understand the number of people who died in the famine, precisely because village chowkidars and mortuary workers in cremation and burial grounds had succumbed to hunger. So again, this is 1943, moment of mass death, where the colonial state documents tell us about the issues of mortuary work. And the effacement, if we know, like we again know that these moments of mass death did not really lead to radical change when it comes to perception of death work, because we have come to a very similar time. And we are again going through that same cycle of recognition, and one can only predict where that will take us. So I'll just stop here and ask Sohini 1 to speak about the last half.
Yeah, thanks, Rohini. That was a fabulous presentation. So just picking up from where Sohini 2 left, which is moments of mass death. So I had written the story last year. This year, actually, we've seen some representation of crematoria worker, We've also seen some crowdfunding campaigns, at least on social media, about getting money to feed crematoria workers who are working 24/7. But last year, if you remember, the stories about striking workers were all entirely about doctors and nurses. And my story, which I put it up on my website in case anybody is interested, I could not do it for any outlet because nobody was willing to speak on the record, despite my networks and connections with the community of mortuary assistants in Calcutta. And even this year, as she's saying that death workers become visible suddenly during a moment of mass crisis. We've seen stories about and fundraising campaigns, but we don't really know their names. It's just it's a very perfunctory sort of reporting, and compared to the reporting on doctors and nurses strikes, it's very little in number. Next slide. And we're just wrapping up now with couple of Hindi film examples of Erasure. So this is a film that many of you may have come across. It's called Article 15, and there is a couple of deaths which receive a post-mortem. So these particular screenshots are with the hero, the protagonist is saying, did you perform the girl's post-mortem? And you can clearly see, she's saying that it was a gang rape. But what is of interest to me and to our discussion here is note the coding of the character who is saying and the person who has done the post-mortem. So she is a doctor. You can make that out from the white coat. You can make that out from the stethoscope. Next slide. Again, another Hindi film. Sorry for the poor quality of the images. They're actually photographs of the film playing, because you can't take screenshots on most OTT platforms these days. This is from a film called Mardani 2. Again, there is a post-mortem that is required of a rape incident. And here again, if you notice the first screenshot, which is the one on the left above, if you notice, you can see the white coat of the doctor, and she's making this very specific, medically precise statement. She has multiple contusions and deep lacerations to the neck and back. And the second screenshot, of course, you see the protagonist of the film, Rani Mukherjee, played by Rani Mukherjee, saying, "Thank you, doctor." I refer to these two films in particular because my presentation was about mortuary assistants, and we saw, to the best of my ability, I tried to bring up how the 90 to 95%, we don't have a precise figure, but much of the dissection work is actually done by assistants who are Dalit labor and not by the doctor. But we have that, that continuing history of erasure playing out in popular culture as well, where you see these white-coated doctors, professionals making these statements. So you get the impression that medico-legal, it is actually very skilled and specialized work. If you remember the specific excerpts from Rudranil Sengupta's work, which was about how these cuts are made for dissections, but it's only on screen or in the public domain. We imagine that it is doctors, very skilled, trained surgeons who do it. The first glimpse of the morgue, this is from the film Kahani 2012. I think, in a popular culture, in mainstream media, this is the first time you see the morgue as a place of that makes you throw up, as a very dirty, filthy place with a stench. So just important in that sense. But of course, you don't see you neither see doctors nor do you see mortuary assistants, but it gives you a sense of a difficult place to be in. Next slide. Yeah, so this is, I think, my concluding slide before the references. So the one film where you see the visibilizing of Dalit labor is Masan, and the character played by Vicky Kaushal, he's a dome, and this is mentioned in the film, of course. But this is really to something that Sohini mentioned in her presentation, that in popular culture, we don't see the incinerator, we don't see crematoria, we see funerals, open funerals of the sort that Hindus practice. So Masan, while it is a very important documentation of caste and caste labor, but it still plays to that idea of the traditional work of Dalit labor, that is burning of the bodies. Whereas my presentation today was about how such the domes and Dalit laborers have been incorporated into the so-called modern, of course it is modern, but into evidence-based systems of medicine where they perform modern procedures. So, of course, this does happen. If you go to Banaras, you see a lot of domes, and there's a dome Raja as well. In fact, I don't know if you remember when Prime Minister Narendra Modi stood from Varanasi for a second time in 2019. There was a person who signed his whatever they signed, the affidavit for the candidature, and it was the Dome Raja of Varanasi. But this plays to this, portrays the traditional stereotypes. So that's it. That concludes my talk. There's a next slide which for references, in case anybody wants to look up the excerpts and the things that I referred to. So that's it.
So thank you. That was a very intense, I would say, talk on a very complex subject, and I'm sure this would have stimulated thoughts and questions. So we open the floor now for any questions that we have. A little time check. We are slightly behind schedule, so I would request the questions to be brief. So you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask the questions. If you wish to direct to specifically one of them, you can mention Sohini 1 and Sohini 2 as a workable solution. So while others make up their mind, let me share my thoughts. Not a question, just a thought that came from what I heard. And I'm trying to draw an analogy here from the work of housewives. So in villages, so housewives, midwives, I'm sorry, midwives. So midwifery is a very skilled, I would say, a skilled job. And in villages, at least, it's a caste job. Now, cut to modern cities, the same has been placed into an institutional setup of hospitals where the same task is done by nurses. The other analogy that I draw is the difference between rare skills and complex skills. So a surgeon has a complex skill and he has been paid for that complexity of the skill that he possesses. But in a open economy, in a open market economy, the rare skills should also be paid handsomely, right? So this death work may not be a complex skill, that's debatable, but it's certainly a rare skill. And so suppose a surgeon is paid 1 lakh per month, why not we have a death worker paid 1 lakh, and then given a technological technician name placed in an institutional setup with symbols that are, professional symbols and institutional symbols, at least that would break up or weaken the tight linkage or tight coupling that we have between caste and death work. Your thoughts?
Sure, I'll go first. Of course, but if you remember, as the other Sohini pointed out, that capitalism has a demand for cheap labor, and it uh, utilizes India's caste divisions, or well, not just India, the subcontinent's caste divisions very well to furnish cheap labor. So, of course, and I agree with what you're saying, but in some places, of course, it's not dome. The nomenclature is Safai Karmachari, and in at least referring to my work, the presentation I made on mortuary assistance, it is actually very skilled work. If you remember, somebody wrote, Srudranil Sengupta wrote this, that it is the work of a forensic surgeon, and the person that he described doing a dissection did it very precisely. So it is skilled work, and from, I'm sure Sohini will be able to tell you much better. I think crematoria work, at least managing those machines, is actually a skill.
Yeah, just to jump on that, I mean, of course, and again, just to reiterate the same point that we are in a system that thrives and sniffs out cheap labor and uh, sort of picks up on existing forms of social divisions to ensure that the pricing is low, and that's something that private entities to governmental entities they'll all do. Um, so that's one of the reasons why your very socialistic perception is sort of failing at our present system. And but at the same time, like historically speaking, it's not like there has not been moments in times of mass death, as the example of plague was brought out, that workers themselves fought for better rights and got a hike in their salary. Was that enough? No, of course. Like it was the bare minimal on an amount that was already so low. But there are instances of these protests and strikes, and that has tried to course correct this problematic linear history of uh, cheap working conditions and cheap labor. So that has been there. It's not like that has radically transformed the powers that be, but those are some of the historical moments that we do see. And I'm sure there has been more. It's just that it's only at these times of epidemics and pandemics that they actually reach the colonial state archives in the way that it does. So to me, if I were reading it uncritically as a historian, I would think of it as, oh wow, there was a strike during the moment of plague because there were so many number of bodies. It is discounting the fact or ignoring the fact that there may have been multiple strikes, which we do not see in our mainstream archival documents.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Kranti. Can you, Kranti, speak up?
Yeah, thanks, Shalindra. Thanks, Sohini and Sohini, for a wonderful talk. So it just got me thinking that do we see similar caste patterns in death work in private hospitals also? I'm asking this question mainly because I feel because there is a particular casteist nature to the kind of work, and especially in the supply of labor. It's almost like a guaranteed supply of labor from a particular community that wages itself remain low despite the changing skill nature of the work. As you are pointing, as the systems change or the methods of death work change, the skills are also updating perhaps, but it's not keeping up with the wage hike, right? So what are your thoughts on that? Yeah, thank you. Either of you can take the question.
Thanks, Kranti. See, I wouldn't, since I haven't done research on private hospitals, I wouldn't venture an answer. The reason I didn't do research on private hospitals is that it's much harder to get permission rather than a public hospital. But you do realize that post-mortems only take place in government hospitals, because it is you need a police case, you need a case of a unnatural death for this particular kind of work to happen.
Thank you. We have a question from the Chinmay Tumbe. Professor Tumbe, if you can speak up or your question.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, thanks for this
Yeah.
very interesting talk. I mean, I've pointed out something in the chat, but I have a question on, since we are now comparing different professions and occupations, how do dome workers themselves see, say, for example, manual scavengers? You know, I mean, that would be the closest occupation I would compare with. And I'm asking this because there seems to be a lot of similarities. Like, for example, what Sohini was pointing out, this incinerator, a new technology shock, changing the relationship of the person with the machine, but also then power structures within caste and so on. And you see a lot of that within manual scavenging, because the whole idea is that this technology can completely displace the entire population, which some would say is great because that job is horrendous, going down sewers and so on. But then there's obviously a livelihood loss and so on. So just curious to know, especially within this whole thing, I'm just speculating, do dome workers see themselves as way above, for example, people who are working under the city, so to speak?
Thank you for the question. Sohini, too, do you want to take this?
Yeah, this is like a fantastic question. Thank you. So the brief answer to the National Occupation Code is that cremation workers and burial ground workers are listed in it. I don't know whether it was listed in the 1946 directory list, but it's there in the later ones. And in sort of like the archival sources, obviously it's very difficult to find much stuff on this, but I can give an example that might answer this question. I haven't really thought about it in this fashion, but it's something I was sharing with Sohini earlier on a personal chat, is that like the 1928 strike in Calcutta municipality, which involved, and Tanika Sarkar has written on it, which involved a lot of municipal workers, including sweepers and manual scavengers. They were in a strike for better pay. Mortuary workers were not in it. Or it's not something that Professor Sarkar discusses, but I couldn't find evidence of mortuary workers, even though I thought it will be an interesting point for me to look up and think about strikes by mortuary workers around the same time. But I couldn't find any documentary evidence of their participation. Now, one can speculate on it, which is on one hand, because it is so particular to a specific community, that it carried within itself some amount of bargaining power, which is one option one can think of as a speculation as to why they did not participate. But I think more than that, it is because they were considered to be so primarily tied to the system of municipal activity that is related to something as unavoidable as death, that it is anyway seen as sort of a separate occupation almost. Even if you go through sort of the municipality reports, and in particular the subcommittee reports of burials and cremations, mortuary workers do get an interesting amount of sort of devotion in those reports, which other Safai Karmacharis don't. So there's maybe a politics of number when it comes to how many people are sort of competing for the jobs and so on. But these are all very speculative responses, unfortunately. I actually don't know.
Thank you, Sohini. We don't have any more questions, but before we close, I just wanted to share people who might be interested in research on death work, that there is a phenomenon unfolding right now in smart cities. Some of the smart cities have a crematorium as part of the plan, but what is the public reaction to it is unfolding right now in Newtown, where I live. There is a proposal of a crematorium right next door. I stay near the cancer hospital, Chitranjan Cancer Hospital, and there is a stream of water which has been selected as a site for crematorium. And the public reaction can be found in Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp groups, which can be a research material, is very revealing. And what I learned is the public have forced the government to abandon this plan. The main argument is that for us, Nimtala is good enough, and it's not that far. So for Calcutta, people would Nimtala is. Nimtala is the traditional burial, cremation place. Yeah. So on that note, people interested in this can use this as a research material. I would like to close this with thanks to all participants, and thank you, Sohini, Sohini 1 and Sohini 2 for your time. That was a very wonderful session, and it has opened up avenues for further engagement on this. I'm sure when it opens up after pandemic, we may engage again. So thank you everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm just feeling so good about being able to be back in a group of PhD students and sharing research. I've been really far from my university for a long time now. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, the pleasure was ours. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.